So now that you have that sort of horrifying description for what's happening with the two-column grid layout, we'll look at it here in the code so we can see what is happening. So just as a refresher and as a mental comparison, you'll remember in 8.2, we looked at exactly the same thing minus the aside element. So in 8.2, we did have the aside. We do not have it here. But we see, roughly speaking, the same thing. We want, on your left-hand side, we want some portion of that page to be taken up by the nav, and we want whatever the rest of the portion of that page is to be taken up by main. So instead of using a fraction of the page, and you'll remember we did that with flex as our property and 1 through 10 as the values. This time around, I already have the code highlighted for us over here. And again, this is in your student files. This is in the 8.4 folder. I'm not 100% sure what the web page is called, but it's in that folder. Excuse me, for you. So here you'll see our wrapper this time is the container that houses our flex grid. You'll see we have grid template columns. So we have two columns. Our first column is 150 pixels wide. Our second column, 1FR, it takes up a one fraction of the rest of the page. So in other words, this takes up the rest of the viewport. If we were to make this a little bit smaller, we could make that value take up less than the full width of the page. We'll actually see this in a future example here in chapter 8. Here's our grid template rows. So you'll remember in our previous example, and you can point to this on page 282 of your textbook. I can't get it to work satisfactory here in OBS, so I'm not going to do that. But I will point you to 282 in your textbook. You'll remember we had our grid lines. So line number 1 was the left-hand side of your viewport for the columns. Line number 2 was this 150 pixel wide second line to make our first column in there. And then everything else that went this way, that's our 1FR. And that goes here from the start of the end of our first column, line number 2, and it goes all the way over to line number 3, which is the right-hand side of our page. For our rows, what I have highlighted here, our first row is 150 pixels tall. Our next row is auto, so however much space the viewport needs. And our third row is 50 pixels tall. You'll notice that copyright on the bottom is not very tall. That one is our third row. So how does this work? We are saying here on line number 43 that as part of our grid, which is part of our wrapper, so grid row takes up, it starts at 1 and it goes to 2. So if we look at our row, remember that's the way across. It starts on our left-hand side and it goes one column over. Remember, that's 150 pixels. And if you look at over here, if you look at our nav, that's roughly 150 pixels. It's about 3 times as wide as this 50 pixel area here for my footer. That looks about right. Grid column, so remember the columns, it starts on 1 and it goes all the way to 3. So that means it goes across your page. And if we look up here at that Lighthouse Island Bistro, my mistake, this is where we should be. If you look up here, that's where that should be. The nav, this is where the nav comes in. I apologize. I was looking forward a little bit. It starts at row 2. So that line is right here, the bottom of the lighthouse image. and it ends at 3. So that comes down to here. So you'll notice that I have the code for you highlighted here. That is inside of our wrapper element. Remember the last time around we had this inside of, I believe in 8.2, it was called the container element. This time around, wrapper. So the thing that traditionally in chapter 7 has gone immediately inside of your body and is closed immediately before your body. So it's where you keep all of your stuff. Now what we're saying here with grid template columns, this is on line 41. We are saying, remember the columns go up and down, that we have 2 columns. Our first column is 150 pixels wide. And if you look at our web page over here on the right hand side, if you look at the nav, that's about 150 pixels wide. If you look at that lighthouse image, that's about 150 pixels wide. That's doing what we want it to do. So that here on line number 41 is our first value for our grid template columns, that 150 pixel wide column going up and down your page. The next 1FR, that means 1 fraction. Take up the rest of everything that's, wide. All of this space going up and down on your page. So we have a 2-column page layout made with those 2 values in our grid template columns property. So our first column is 150 pixels wide. Our second column is 1 fraction. Everything else. Now we have grid template rows. This is on line 42. So how many rows do I have? This time around I have 3 rows. Now remember, we've got, so 3 rows wide. Remember, the rows go across your page. So where do we have this across my page? The first one, 150 pixels. So look across your page and we've got our row. That's what's happening through here, that 100 pixels wide. Auto, that's the rest of everything coming across my page. And then we have 50 pixels. And I'll tell you the little secret here. If you look over on the right-hand side of your page, we have this little area over here where there's no text running up right to, the right-hand side of your page. That is that 50 pixel space happening right there. So if we look at header, nav, and main as far as our grid row and grid column descriptors go, here's our property for grid row, here's our property for grid column, and 1/2 is our value, 1/3 is our value. So let's just take a look at header, and I'll let you take a look at the other ones to see how these translate out. If we look at header, it starts, so the header is up here, that is our Lighthouse Island Bistro. It is this area right here in your code, 53, 54, 55. So look at header. Our header starts on row 1 and it ends with the line 42. So it starts at the very top of our viewport and it ends at the very first opportunity there. Grid column. It starts at 1, which remember is the very end of our viewport, and it goes all the way across the area that we have there, that 1 fraction it goes across. If we take a look at nav, I'll stop at nav. It starts grid row, 2 out of 3. So it starts right here. So this is our row line, the one that goes wide across the page. It starts at 2 and it ends on 3, which is what you see right there, that line. Grid column starts 1, so that's over here at the left-hand side of our page, stops at 2, which is this line right here. So you can build as many columns, you can build as many rows as you want by adding rows and columns into your grid template for columns and grid template for rows. We're going to see another way to do this, yet another way to do this here in Chapter 8. So remember, the way we have this set up in 8.2 is one potential way of doing that. We use the flex property, flex 1 for your order, flex 2 for the order number, flex 3 the order number. So then remember the property flex had the value of 1 for nav, 8 I believe for main, and then 1 for the figure. Here what we're saying is, if you draw a grid like we have on page 282, you can see where elements start and how far they should go by telling the browser where elements end. So simply by having 2 columns and having 2 rows, we have created these 4 areas here inside of our web page to be able to put all of that. So that goes all the way down to footer as well. So take a look, compare it to page 282. See what line number 1 is and where line number 2 is for your rows. See where line number 1 is for your column and where line number 3 is for your column. So remember, columns go, up and down. So they start with the far right-hand side of your browser, or the far left-hand side. That's my right, by the way. So the far left-hand side of your browser, and they travel all the way to the far right. Your rows start at the very top of your browser, and they go all the way down to the very bottom, or where you have the material stop. So this is how a grid works using just the grid template.